Good morning. Thank you, Nate. I appreciate that. And as indicated on the slide, on the screen, the title of today's first panel is A Prisoner's Dilemma, the 10-Year Defense Outlook. The prisoner's dilemma, as you probably know, is the best-known game of strategy in social science, having its basis in game theory. And simply put, the concept demonstrates why two purely rational individuals might not cooperate even when it appears that it is in their best interests. This morning we're going to look at this dilemma in a different manner, in which two entities, namely the United States and its strategic partners, could gain important security benefits from cooperating or suffer from the failure to do so. These entities may find it difficult or even expensive, but not necessarily impossible, to coordinate their activities to achieve cooperation, and by doing so, increase the probability of achieving their national interests and their policy objectives. A range of internal and external pressures are affecting the size, structure, and missions of the United States and its partner military forces. Internally, the United States, in addition to resource constraints within the Departments of Defense and within the US government, especially the differing visions, perhaps, between the executive and legislative branches, there are foreign policy constraints that are a result of what we have been experiencing over the last decade or so. And these issues are made more difficult, perhaps, by the vacillating public opinion about what America's role in the world should be. Externally, the United States and its partners face a diverse array of compelling challenges that range from great power competition in the Far East, hybrid forms of competition with Iran and Russia, to a collapsing order in the volatile Middle East. All these events present unique threats to American national security interests, and further, when combined, they may be emblematic of the next decade's most urgent and powerful trials. In addition to these known threats, both so-called gray and black swans populate the strategic landscape. If political and military leaders do not perceive or consider them, these events may create catastrophic results and disrupt American security and consequently rend US defense strategy and associated plans. There are, however, also new opportunities emerging with respect to defense policy and strategy. As examples, new partnerships and a federated approach to securing common interests may be essential to a stable US national security future. Given those challenges and opportunities, this panel this morning will examine some of the significant questions they prompt. For example, what are the most salient internal and external drivers of defense strategy and planning over the next decade? In addition to known or assumed demands, what pressing and potentially disrupted demands should the Department of Defense account for in its planning? Or perhaps what opportunities exist for the Defense Department to leverage US and allied strengths? To examine and begin to answer these questions, four prominent strategic thinkers join me this morning. Their complete biographies are in your program, so I will abbreviate their biographical information to leave sufficient time for their presentations and for the question and answer period that will follow. To my immediate right is Dr. Michael Meese, Chief Operating Officer and Secretary of the American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association. Dr. Meese retired from the United States Army as a Brigadier General, concluding a 32-year career as a professor and head of the Department of Social Sciences at the U.S. Military Academy. He has, as you'll read in the program, a distinguished career in the military, and he holds a PhD from Princeton University. To his right, two places to the right, Dr. Kori Schake. Dr. Schake is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution from 2007 to 2008. She was the Deputy Director of Policy Planning in the Department of State. During the President George W. Bush's first term, she was the Director for Defense Strategy and Requirements on the National Security Council. And she was responsible there for the interagency coordination of long-term defense planning and coalition maintenance issues. She holds a PhD from the University of Maryland. Our third presenter will be Dr. Janine Davidson. Dr. Davidson is a Senior Fellow for Defense Policy at the Council for Foreign Relations. Her areas of expertise are defense strategy and policy, military operations, national security, and civil military relations. And before joining CFR, Dr. Davidson was an assistant professor at George Mason University And from 2009 to 2012, she served in the Obama administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Plans, where she oversaw the development of guidance for military campaign and contingency planning. She also began her career as a U.S. Air Force officer, and she holds a PhD from the University of South Carolina. And our last speaker is filling in for Dr. Hooker, graciously willing to do so. Play, if you will, batter up. Clean up. And that's Dr. Joseph J. Collins. He is the director of the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University. He joined NDU and the National War College faculty in 2004 as a professor of national security strategy. He has served 3 years as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability Operations. He retired as a U.S. Army colonel after nearly 28 years of service in a series of distinguished infantry and armor career assignments. Taught at West Point in the Department of Social Sciences and holds a PhD from Columbia University. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Meese.
Great. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I applaud both the Army War College for sponsoring this strategy conference and the partnerships that you have with National Defense University and all of the centers at the National Defense University. I think that's a great partnership, and the partnership with OSD Policy is excellent to make this not just a 2-day or 3-day conference, but one that'll carry forward. If we're using the analogy of a prisoner's dilemma, I think what I'll do in the brief opening comments is outline the box of that prisoner's dilemma. Although the Deputy Secretary of Defense said it doesn't matter how much money we have, actually it does a little bit. And so I think focusing for at least a few minutes up front on some of the constraints on the economy are worthwhile. And so that's why I'm going to focus on the economic and fiscal issues. I've got some slides here. Since I know the other panelists are bringing substance, I figured I would bring slides instead. I'm going to identify 4 issues with 4 implications for you to think about in today's panel, as well as for the ensuing panels that come. The first, and again, I'll use the analogy of a pie. This pie that we're talking about, called the economy, is actually really, really important. And it's important to national security because you can't have national security without economic growth and economic security, and both are inextricably linked. When President Eisenhower was dealing with this, he called this the great equation of how do you provide military strength on one hand while providing economic strength on the other. Specifically, he said, national security requires an industrious and productive America, for here is the vital source of all military strength. To watch vigilantly on the military front must never mean to be blind on the domestic economic front. So as we go through the panels throughout the day, which I think are going to be excellent on the Mideast and on Asia and on Europe, how do we as military leaders get the economic input? Frankly, whether you agree or disagree with the potential agreement with Iran, economic sanctions were probably what drove Iran to be able to bargain there. And who's the key advisor for the CENTCOM commander on economic sanctions? Where does the military leaders in PACCOM get advice on how to use the Asian Development Bank to try to cripple North Korea's bank accounts? How do we use our trade with Europe as an influence there, and how does the EUCOM commander get that advice? Do we have a mechanism within our government to be able to integrate the powerful economy of the United States to complement our national security? So that's sort of the first issue, is that this pie is actually important, and I think as national security policymakers, we don't consider the integration of it very well. The second is, how is that pie doing? Well, the bottom line is it's growing, but not growing as much. And I've spoken to most of the War College students here earlier in the fall, so I'll just briefly put this up. This shows since 1970 the growth of the U.S. economy, where the blue lines are when we've been growing, and the red lines are the recession. So while all of you were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, what the nation was experiencing was the greatest recession since the Great Depression, deeper and longer and more significant than any previous economic impact that we've had in our nation. The implication of that is, okay, we've come out of that, but we fundamentally changed, and we can get into in questions and answers why we fundamentally changed the level of growth that we have in the economy. As you can see, prior to the Great Recession, we were growing at about 3.5% every year. Now we're just growing at about 2.2% every year. That 1% doesn't seem like a lot of difference, but when we're looking on a 10-year defense outlook, the growth of the US economy, which is right now $17.7 trillion, if we were growing at the previously existing rate, we'd be at 26 trillion. Now we're only going to be at about 22.5 trillion. That's $3.5 trillion of lost wages, of lost productivity, of lost taxes, of lost money that could go to the defense. So the pie is not growing as big as it has been in the past. Frankly, since the population growth is about 2%, we won't be able to do the American dream because the next nation going forward will not be any larger than the number of people that are in it. We can't be getting better because of the fundamental changes to the economy. If you're looking at it from a national security perspective, so the second implication is the pie is not getting any bigger. Well, if our slice of the pie was getting bigger, that might be okay with regard to defense, but in fact, that's not the case, as you can see here. These are the major categories of government spending, with defense there at the bottom, domestic spending, healthcare, individual payments, and interest. To put some numbers on that, when President Eisenhower gave his military-industrial complex speech in 1960, 50% of what the federal government was spending money on was defense. In President Obama's FY16 budget, it will go to 15%. And that hasn't been replaced by domestic spending on domestic agencies. In fact, those have decreased. It's been replaced in terms of federal spending with a substantial expansion of healthcare, now almost 1.5 times the size of the defense budget, and almost doubling of individual payments. In fact, and I picked 1960 because that happened to be the year that I was born, we've done an exact reversal. In 1960, 71% of the budget was discretionary and 29% was mandatory. We've now turned that on its head so that Congress is fighting over the 28% that remains being discretionary, with the mandatory part, mostly entitlements, of our budget being as large as it was, as all of the discretionary was combined back in 1960. What does this mean in terms of national security? That entitlement reform should be a fundamental priority for the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Not because he has any particular expertise on Social Security or when the retirement age should be, but because if entitlements are not reformed going in the future, or if we don't look at the expansion of Medicare programs and Medicaid programs, it will continue to squeeze out the defense budget, and it won't be an argument of whether we pop the thing on sequestration with a budget gimmick this year or not. You won't have the money in the future to be able to provide for the long-term national security of the United States. So the pie is important. It's not growing as big. Our slice of the pie is getting smaller. And what do we have finally in terms of what are the options going forward? It isn't really rocket science to figure this out. You don't need the technological things of how to use a rail gun and powder cannons or something like that. It's pretty simple. You either need to bring the spending arc down, and this is the projection by the Congressional Budget Office for what we'll be spending in the future from now for the next 10 years, and what we'll be taxing in the future. This assumes no recession. This assumes no economic fallback. Admittedly, it also doesn't assume that we have some huge boom from fracking or something else like that. So this is their best estimate of what will happen. And if you look at Simpson-Bowles or any of the other potential budget plans, they find a compromise where you bring down spending, you reform entitlements, you perhaps reform some aspects of defense spending where you can achieve some of the efficiencies that the Deputy Secretary talked about, and or you bring up taxes, because it's not that hard to figure out some method between 18% and 20% before the amount of spending grows up well beyond 22%. In fact, the projections are that we go from a deficit, that's the gap between the green line and the blue line, of about 2%, which is moderate and probably sustainable right now, but in the long run, absent some sort of intelligent, strategic thought from both parties, that gap between what we spend as a nation on our federal spending and what we are willing to pay as a nation is going to continue to grow so that we get Great Recession type levels of deficits without really facing a Great Recession. And that will, in the end, fundamentally impede the options that defense policymakers have going forward. It constrains what we do and is likely not going to get worse before it gets better in the absence of coherent strategic thought. As we take a look to the next 10 years, it's certainly important that we both understand the problem facing us and that we use that to address both the economic and the national security policy issues as we look at the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meese. Appreciate it. I also appreciate you framing the issues for us this morning. Dr. Schake?
So I want to suggest that there are two things that aren't driving American strategy that should be. And the first is money, and the second is the loss of dominance. And on the first count, you know, it grew out of the Napoleonic Wars, this notion by the military that strategy should somehow be done as an abstraction. That is, that it shouldn't be, the starting point for strategy should somehow be unconstrained by resources. And that's always been a fiction. It's not, you know, when I hear people in DOD talk about how, you know, we need a strategy that's not impinged by resources. Of course you would want that. Nobody's ever had that, right? The definition of strategy is that you're constrained by resources, and you have to figure out how to do it. So the place I would start is the Department of Defense ought to submit a budget consistent with the law. None of the stuff about sequestration would be triggered if DOD's budget was compliant with the law. You've just submitted the fourth budget that is going to trigger sequestration. So outside of defense circles, you know, I live in California on the edge of empire, and people are wholly unimpressed with DOD's claims that they don't have enough money to do what's necessary. Because, first of all, as Mike said, the country's actually been in a recession, and money feels tight everywhere. So, you know, that we don't have enough money is everybody's experience. It's not just your experience. The second piece of that is that the Defense Department looks extraordinarily well-resourced to people outside the Defense Department. I know money seems tight to you all, but it doesn't look tight when 45% of global defense spending is spent by the United States. So when the Joint Chiefs of Staff went up to Capitol Hill these last several years and declared that sequestration would be apocalyptic, how many votes did it change on Capitol Hill? None. It didn't change any votes. That should tell you something, which is that Congress, the American political system, is extraordinarily tightly tied to American public attitudes, right? These folks are always running for office. And the fact that it didn't change a single vote to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, seriatim, for the last 4 years, claim that this would be the end of the world as we know it, should tell you that no more money is coming to the Defense Department. You actually need to be compliant with the top line ceiling that Congress has passed. You may this year get around it by shoveling money into the OCO accounts, but you ought actually to bring your budget into compliance with the law, because that's the way to have the budget stability that you're looking for, and you're not going to get it any other way. You're not even going to get it from Republicans, because the budget hawks are ascendant in the Republican Party, and they're ascendant in Congress. The defining fact for Republicans in Congress is that 31 cents of every dollar the United States spends, it is borrowing. That's why the Joint Chiefs of Staff appeals about overriding sequestration don't get any traction. The dominant fact of the American military for the next 10 years is going to be resource constraints. And that's the place to start with our strategy, because if you get any relief, it's going to be a marginal one-off, and I personally don't think that's even going to pass in the Congress. So cost-efficient strategy is actually the game we should be playing. It's not the game we are playing. I really liked all the sections of the Deputy Secretary's speech where he was talking about the need to be more creative. And you know, we're always talking about the need to be more creative, but I went through the last QDR, and I went through General Dempsey's response to it, and it was all about creativity, but the document itself showed almost none of that capacity, right? It was an appeal for new thinking without a whole bunch of new thinking. And we need to do better than that, because my second point is that we are already living in a world in which crucial elements of our dominance in the American military are being overridden either by commercial industry or by adversaries. Paul Kaminsky, who was he was the Assistant Secretary for AT&L when Bill Perry was Secretary, wrote a fantastic report about 16 crucial slices of technology and he looked at who are the most important innovators in these areas. They weren't predominantly Americans. And our entire defense development and acquisition system is built on a model that we are going to be the dominant producers of innovation. And we actually already are not. We, the Defense Department, already are not the dominant producers of them. We need to limber up this model hugely. Otherwise, we are going to be living in a world not only where we don't have air dominance and cyber dominance, but where we get surprised on the battlefield by overarching capabilities from other militaries. You all ought to be burning the midnight oil to figure out, how do we adapt fast enough when we are overmatched? Because that is going to be the nature of the problem. And let me just give a commercial example. I live in Silicon Valley, and you know, I grant you right up front that the technology mavens, the masters of the technology universe, are every bit as reprehensible and tiresome as Wall Street masters of the universe. But they are onto something, right? Which is, I was at the President's Cyber Summit at Stanford a couple of weeks ago. People were much less impressed with the leader of the free world, by which I mean the elected president of these United States, than they were impressed by Tim Cook, who they actually believe is the leader of the free world. And what Tim Cook said in his speech in front of the President of the United States is, we will not permit the American government to troll for your data at Apple, right? That we are the only people you can trust with your data, and the American government can't get its hands on it. That is the world we are going to be looking at, right? He's not our enemy, he's us. And so building a defense strategy that accounts for very limited resources by the standards of the last 20 years, and that realizes you are not going to have access to cutting-edge technologies. You are going to have to figure out ways to beat those technologies when when you are not the owners of them, whether those owners are corporate America, innovative Dutch ceramics firms, or our actual enemies in the world, because I think those are the main constraints on the problem. We, as an American military, are extraordinarily good at a lot of things. We are not good at cost-efficient solutions. And I hope you will spend a lot of time figuring out how to be, because I think that's the nature of the competition in the coming 10 years.
Davidson?
Well, I can't believe this, but I'm in agreement with Kori on so many things she just said. Look, it's pretty clear that things are going to have to change. I just got back from California, hiking in Big Sur, and you know, CFR, where I work, sends me out to talk to people around the country, and Kori's right. The American people just do not understand why it is we can spend $100 billion more than we were spending in real dollars during the Cold War and still not kind of sort of get the job done, right? I mean, they look at Iraq, they look at Afghanistan, they look what's happening in Russia, and they're like, what? We've got this super high-tech machine, you know, but the security problems that we face seem to be confounding us somehow. How does that work? I want to look a little bit internally at the way we plan. I kind of am starting to think that the way we do force planning, the gonculator of the Pentagon, what we do to spit out our budget and our force structure, is very broken. I think it's out of sync with the security environment. I think it's potentially irrelevant to some things, and it's definitely becoming increasingly unaffordable. You know, the way it works is that we plan for the most dangerous scenario, right? Not the most likely scenario. And you heard the deputy kind of bemoan this a little bit this morning. You know, we've been doing peacekeeping, we've been doing all this other stuff, you know, we really should be doing this high-end stuff, which is what we're supposed to be planning for. Well, we've been saying that over and over again, but I don't have to tell the people in this room that that is repeatedly not what you keep getting asked to do, right? So we're planning for the highest end, most dangerous threat, and we're sort of assuming away all the most likely things that we have to do. And what does that planning for the highest end threat look like? It's exquisitely expensive. It requires, we have a paradigm that says we have got to have the best technology. We have got to have huge overmatch. I'm thinking in order to get to where Kori's talking about, we need to fundamentally re-examine those kinds of things, because let's look at the technology piece. Getting to the next gizmo is not necessarily going to make us safer in the long term. I'm all for a lot of the innovative ideas that the deputy talked about, but that also presupposes that we're already in a fight, right? And what's happening when you look at, you'll hear Nadia Shadlow speak this afternoon, and she had a brilliant piece in War on the Rocks where she talked about, you know, our adversaries are changing the strategic dynamic by actively, on purpose, riding right below the threshold of what we consider to be war, right? So, I mean, oh, by the way, we've just learned that you can take over a country, Crimea, you know, without sort of firing big shots, right? Without getting to the thing that NATO would say is a war. That's really clever, and we have to think about that as a country. And we also have to think about that as a military, because if the military decides that its only role, which is what NATO has basically done, is to wait for the thing that looks like war, to react and to respond and to think through the threat, then we're going to continue to lose. Because our technological advantage in the sort of American way of war is not only being challenged in that sort of anti-access area denial high-end area, but it's also being challenged, as it always has been, very cleverly by people who just go around the whole thing and change the facts on the ground and change the security dynamic without even getting to the point where we would consider warfare. So I think that's a pretty big problem that we have to consider. The other piece about this American way of war that influences sort of baked into the cake of the way we plan is that it's increasingly unaffordable. I mean, if you think about major weapons systems, as an example, F-16 took 6 years from 1972 to 1978, from like an idea to actual operationally employed, $15 million a piece. The F-35, 19 years, 186 million, and some variants a lot more than that. We're talking about the need to have long-range strike because what defines, I think, partly what defines American power is our ability to project, is our reach. Long-range strike, they're talking about it could be $500 million a pop. $500 million. How do you have a fleet of aircraft when they cost that much? And this is what's happened, I think, with our American way of war embedded into our force planning constructs, is that it has, over time, because of our faith in technology and exactly what Secretary Work said, which is put technology forward so you can bring people back, right? And people are very, very expensive. Let's talk about that. We have traded quantity for quality increasingly over time. The Air Force fleet, which you rely on for your ground fight, is all smallest it's ever been since 1947. And at those prices, it's going to keep getting smaller. And so if our planning system is focused on a battle, great. But if it's focused on projecting power, and if it's focused on being able to do more than one thing at a time, we're going to have to start thinking about taking risk and getting that balance of quantity and quality in a different way. Because it's not going to be affordable, and we're not going to have the kind of global reach that we need, that the American people, despite the fact they don't want to pay it more for it, have demonstrated that they expect. You know, when bad things happen, especially when people are getting hurt, the American people do want you guys, us, military, to respond. So I think that we have a bit of a conundrum. So when we think about whether it's a choice or whether it's going to happen because we're not the innovators that we used to be or that other people are catching up, we need to think about what warfare looks like with a different kind of technological advantage. If we don't have the technological superiority that we've gotten accustomed to. And it really, I think, is important when it comes to the ground fight. And this is why I was also intrigued by the deputy talking about air-land 2.0. What does the ground fight look like if you don't have air superiority anymore? And you know, however many F-35s we can afford to buy, if you can swarm drones that are cheap and you can take things out of the sky, I mean, the American military and all of our allies have something that we haven't had since, you know, people haven't had since the mid-20th century. When you look up into the sky and you hear a noise, you think, our enemies don't think that, right? So imagine a battlefield where when you look up into the sky, that's not how you feel. That's not how you feel. We don't even contemplate that in our defense planning structures. We don't even think about what it's like to not have air superiority, or just assume that we're going to keep getting it and we're going to keep paying for it, and that's not going to be the case. And so, and it's not just because the American people won't pay for it, it's because of all the other dynamics that Kori also mentioned about technological innovation and the way in which our enemies are also adapting. So with all that bad news, I'm going to end on a good note, because Nate told us to talk about our advantages and our disadvantages, and I've just talked about our disadvantage being our bureaucratic gonculator in the Pentagon that is fixable eventually. But our major advantage, I think it is true, are our people. And when you talk about force balances, people have learned over time that you have to actually factor in the way in which we are trained and educated and organized as an incredible advantage. And despite the fact that we were organized, trained, and equipped for a different kind of fight, I believe that over the last 10 to 15 years, we adapted rather rapidly. I even wrote a book on it for the small numbers of you that may have read it. And that is an amazing strength, is our ability to adapt when the time comes. But when the gonculator is so far out of sync with the things you get asked to do, that makes your adaptation a lot harder. I think we can bring those two things together, and I think that we're smart enough to do it.
Okay, let's see. I have to stand up. I'm the oldest in the panel, and if I sit for too long, my hips freeze up. The good news is that I can only stand up for 10 minutes. Well, here we are at the Army War College Strategy. The panel is almost done. Everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. So I started out, I wrote a little thing here called 10 Thoughts About Defense in the Next 10 Years. And I thought as people were talking, I would check them off. But it's more fun just to repeat what everybody else said. One original thing. Let's look where we are today. Where are we starting this launch into the next 10 years? The United States currently leads the world in military technology, operational military capabilities, and combat experience. In fact, it probably has more combat experience than any other army in recorded histories, perhaps with the exception of the Roman Empire. Our gargantuan defense budget is bigger than the next 20 or so nations combined. On top of all of that, we're still an attractive power. Our 60 friends and allies account for 80% of the world's gross national product. 80%. Okay, and we still meet the 1943 definition of superpower. We have great power and great mobility of power. And today, still, we are, in the eyes of many, the only military superpower in the world. So, as my Italian mother-in-law says, when it comes to national security and military power, we're crying with a loaf of bread under each arm. And we just have to recognize that's where we're starting our launch into the future. But all that said, power is diffuse in the system, and challenges will remain. 10 years from now, and this is the second of the 10 thoughts, the security environment will be more complicated. We will have stronger near-peer competitors in China and Russia. We could have stronger regional competitors in North Korea and Iran, although I think the latter is probably more likely than the former. And we will be dealing with the rump of the long war. And in the rump, today, we have Iraq, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, North Africa, Yemen, Mali. In fact, as the war winds down for the United States, it's not winding down for a lot of other people. At the same time, government spending will be strapped. Defense resources will be at a premium. There will be more requirements than resources, and that, by the way, is the normal state of affairs. That was a presentation I wrote for then Major General John Shalikashvili to give to retired Army 4-stars in 1986. The requirements resources gap. Our enemies will remain clever thinking beings. And number 3, our clever thinking adversaries will continue to confound us in all the ways the Deputy Secretary talked about today. Cyber, insurgency, lone wolf terrorism, hybrid warfare, nuclear proliferation. Across the globe, that great category of things we call irregular conflicts will be the most numerous and frequent type of occurrence. But there are those 3 challenges that I mentioned before. So the U.S. SecDef, the chairman, and the chiefs will have to pursue readiness across the spectrum of conflict. And I think I say that 5 times in this little speech. Number 4, because of changes in the security environment, We will have to be more inhibited in using force in the next decade than we were from 1990 to the present. We will once again, as in the Cold War, have to figure out how to keep large numbers of highly ready, CONUS-based or forward-deployed troops ready for combat, but not in combat. Today, what we're doing is we've reversed the Cold War procedure. We have very few ready forces in the United States. Most forces are being brought up to a high level of readiness and then deployed, or if they're deployed, they're kept in a high level of readiness in a slightly different way. 10 years from now, we will have to do more, and we'll have to do it with about the same amount of resources or less. Number 5, despite all we know about the security environment, the next war is unpredictable. Unpredictable. How do I know that? We failed to predict all of the other ones. I think that trend will continue. We failed to predict the attack at Pearl Harbor. We failed to predict the start of the Korean War. We failed to predict the Cuban Missile Crisis. We failed to predict the onset of the Gulf War, in spite of the fact that it was in our face. We failed to predict the 9/11 attacks, in spite of the fact that people were screaming that it was about to happen. We failed to predict both the Soviet and the United States invasions of Afghanistan. We failed to predict the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, despite the warnings of many people, to include a magnificent study done here at the Army War College. We failed to predict ISIS, and again, another one that was in our face, et cetera, et cetera. So don't put all your chestnuts on one kind of war. A defense strategy that favors one service or postulates one kind of war, or a favorite of certain admirals in the Pentagon is, well, we'll never do that again. Well, guess what? We've done it before, we'll do it again, and we'll do it again after that. And we, the people in this room, we don't get to choose. The nation often backs into a hornet's nest. And when it does, it doesn't turn to the EPA, it doesn't turn to any of our political parties, it turns to the military and says, oh, what are we going to do now? You're going to have to do something about this. So, number 6, because of the security environment and the unpredictability of future conflicts, the SecDef and the chairman a decade from now will have to maintain a balanced force, prepared to operate across a spectrum of conflict, he said again, for the 3rd time, at the risk of repeating himself. Number 7, regional priorities. We hear this somewhat ridiculous issue go on all the time. First off, on one end of the spectrum, we have some people today who are flirting with neo-isolationism. Just look at the rest of the world and just say no. It's not catching on, except among theorists of international relations and people with, you know, tinfoil hats.
Those are 2 different groups.
Yeah. There are some crossovers. Rebalancing towards Asia-Pacific. That's great when you get to choose. But the Asia-Pacific area is one where diplomacy and trade should lead. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I dare say we don't spend much time on at National or the Army War College, may just well prove to be almost as important as putting a battalion of Marines in Australia. At the same time we're rebalancing, we'll also be doing more work in Europe, and the Middle East cauldron will continue to bubble. And we will ignore all of those things at our peril. So, regional priorities, we used to spend a lot of time talking about that during the Cold War. I'm not sure it's even a rational pursuit. Number 8. To accommodate resource constraints, we should look hard at reducing redundancy in our program. We have tremendous redundancies in our program. Do we need a nuclear triad? Or would a dyad do? we do a study of nuclear experts every 10 years, and we come to the conclusion that the triad is extremely important. We're the only people who have one, really, but it's really important. Do we need 3 versions of the Joint Strike Fighter? Why, for example, are we buying 2 models of the Joint Strike Fighter for the Marine Corps? Do we need Marine Special Operations Command? Or is MARSOC duplicating already existing capabilities? Do we need 5 brigades of Army parachute infantry as well as another brigade-sized force of airborne rangers? I don't know. What's magic about 10 carrier battle groups? Why not 9? Why not 8? Could we build a carrier battle group built around amphibious shipping with vertical and takeoff and land F-35s? Can we design a better personnel system, one with a modernized incentive structure and retirement system? We certainly can. And anybody who thinks that it would be a travesty to turn the military over to a civil service style retirement system, trust me, you don't know what you're talking about. It's a great system. It's a great system. It can be modified for the military. And we've got to break the lock of personnel systems that were designed in 1945 or before. We're choking ourselves on what in Washington are called military entitlements. Yes, there are benefits for the great heroes of this generation. I understand that. I've seen all that happen. But there's only so much money in the pot. So the answer to all these questions is we can do a lot better, but we have to get outside the boxes that we have built for ourselves. In the main, each and all of the services have enough stuff and enough resources. What they lack is imagination and the courage of their convictions. They'd much rather build the much more expensive next generation of System X than to figure out ways to bring new systems and new operational techniques into battle. Okay, number 9, to save money, we need to start designing systems that are not more expensive, advanced versions of their predecessors, but with even more outlandish price tags. $3 billion destroyers. Remember, I think a destroyer is still a ship that's meant to protect a capital vessel. Okay, $3 billion destroyers, $180 million fighters. 550, by the way, is the tag I read yesterday for the Air Force's new bomber. How many people think that that is going to come in at $550 million? The last time we did that with a bomber, it ended up being over $1 billion a copy. Because ultimately what happens is the high price gets jacked up in the research and development process, and when people get to look at the final price tag, they say, well, you can't afford to have all that many, and once they cut the buy, they become even more and more expensive. And so you got the B-2 bomber, terrific system, over $1 billion a copy. And we appear to be on the road to do it again. We're taking decades to build a handful of systems that, as Janine pointed out, fail the quantity-quality test. You know, you can have the greatest F-35 in the world, but if it's in the wrong theater, if it's in the wrong spot because you don't have enough of them, and you guessed wrongly about the unpredictable next conflict, you're going to be out of luck. You may be out of luck anyway if you're on the ground and there's no A-10 and you've got a system that's still being developed that they're not quite sure how it's going to be adapted for close air support. Number 10, we should attend to non-defense issues that impact our national security, the first of which is education, and the second of which is national infrastructure. And as somebody who drove up here from Washington today, I want to tell you, there's a lot of national infrastructure that needs to be repaired. I'll put our potholes in Washington up against yours any day. I hope I've provoked you. Thank you.
Well done.
We have about 22 minutes for questions. We're going to go to 11 o'clock. And before I turn it open to the floor, there are microphones in front of you. If you would please use the microphone, you'll notice that there is a place there, a point where you can depress that little button there. Please do so, because that way everyone will be able to hear you, and keep it pressed until you are finished with your question. Please keep it on, if you will, to questions as opposed to expositions. I'd like to start off, though, if I could. All four of you mentioned affordability as some aspect, budget constraints, the effect of the economy, et cetera. I was wondering if you would address the issue of burden sharing, an old term. We heard Deputy Secretary refer to the Cold War a few times, free riders concepts as well. How is, keeping that in mind, how do you maintain a global order that you find preferable to others by ensuring that both the United States and its allies are living up to, if you will, living up to their own requirements?
So I'll take a shot at that one. I think, so whoever in the White House was stupid enough to use the phrase leading from behind should be working someplace else. But they are actually right that we, the United States, have allowed to accrue to us an enormous amount of risk for outcomes in allied countries that over the course of the last 50 years. And the frame of reference of it that comes to mind for me is how actually the Army thought about the defense of Germany, right? In 1952, the notion was those 125 East German divisions and with Soviet help were going to come into East Germany, and we were going to progressively, with reinforcement from the United States, reconquer the Germany that we were going to keep free. And then air-land battle, which is a great concept, which is you don't wait until they come to you. You take the fight into East Germany. And like we have allowed to expand further and further our concept of allied defense. And we have also allowed to accrue to us more and more of the risk for ensuring those outcomes. And so I actually think the president is right that we need to think about how to rebalance that. But the problem is that they're doing it extraordinarily badly. My favorite example of doing it well is the Clinton administration with East Timor, right? After Somalia, there was no way the United States was going to be able to put troops under a UN command. But East Timor was a serious problem. The Australians were willing to do it. I was, third oar on the left of the galley in the Pentagon at the time. And this set of promises we made to the Australians for what we would do to ensure their success running the UN mission in East Timor was extraordinarily expansive. And it was also extraordinarily private because the Australians were willing to do the most dangerous work. We were going to underwrite their success, and we shut up about it. And we don't do any of those three things anymore, right? Think about the Libya operation. The first thing out the door was that the Europeans could never have done this without our help. Really? The Europeans couldn't actually take down Libyan air defenses without American help? That's crazy. Of course they could. We are talking ourselves and our allies into an acceptance that we are extraordinarily weak compared to the threats we face. And that's not true, right? The Danish Navy could do a really good job against the Russian Navy without any of our help. And by the way, they have all of our help. So we need to actually limber ourselves up into the point where we realize how strong we and, it was Joe who talked about how capable we and our allies are in the world. It's absolutely true. We need to get back to that. So yes, we need to do better burden sharing. And it starts with acknowledging how capable our allies are, right? What the Saudis and their coalition are doing in Yemen is work we want to have done, and we ought to be underwriting it. We ought not to be bragging about all we are doing on the front pages of the New York Times, because that's actually not helpful to achieving the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, I agree entirely with all of that. The rule of burden sharing is that when we do more, the allies do less, and when we do less, the allies do less. It's a terrible dilemma, but tough talking can help. I also think leading from behind can actually be a strategy, even if it can't be a bumper sticker. The Saudis are doing great stuff. We've seen other people do great stuff. Unfortunately, when we hold back, sometimes important things don't get done. In the long war, we've had small footprints and large footprint, armed nation-building endeavors. In Libya, the NATO alliance delivered, we delivered the people of Libya from oppression into chaos. We have a no-footprint post-conflict phase in Libya. And the country still is, every week there's a different kind of crisis going on there. We did a bad job. We thought we would help the Allies. The Allies were much more vitally interested in Libya than we were, and that we would get the job done, and then maybe the EU or the NATO nations with some kind of arrangement would do some sort of post-conflict thing. But again, we didn't plan for it, and it never happened. And the Europeans didn't do very much there. So very, very tough issue. I think we can get tougher with our allies. I remember before the first Gulf War, we had Operation Tin Cup. There were two missions, one led by Baker and one led by Treasury Secretary Brady. And I was carrying luggage on that one. And we went around the world, and we demanded that people contribute to the effort because they all thought the effort was a worthy one, and that if they couldn't send troops, they should send support. And if they couldn't send support, they should send supplies. And if they couldn't send supplies, then they could write us a check.
Turned to profit, too.
It turned to profit. In conservative accounting, it was a $55 billion enterprise, and we collected about $50 billion in doing it. We were told not to ask, for example, we were told by the area experts, X being anyone from out of town with a briefcase. The experts told us, please, do not embarrass the Japanese by asking them for more than $1 billion. The Japanese ended up giving $13 billion. It's all out there for the creative use of the diplomatic and the financial instruments in terms of burden sharing. Afghanistan, we did better in Afghanistan than we did in Iraq, certainly by way of the burden sharing. But, again, we let a lot of people off the hook. And they basically said, listen, we're going to come here, we're going to be armed, and we're going to be covered in Kevlar, but we're not going to do any fighting. We'll do everything else, but we're not going to do any fighting. I don't know why we put up with that. I really don't.
Mike?
Yeah, I would sort of respond in contrast to Joe. I think Afghanistan is a good example. We never mention it here, but up until last year, there were 49 nations that stayed in for the entire time frame in Afghanistan through both administrations, through great cultivation, and thanking those countries for what they have done and stayed there. I went over and spoke to the Danish War College last year, and they have kept 2 battalions there the entire time. Now, they may not be doing the robust operations that we want them to do. Many of them are doing training. Many of them are doing security. But those are less U.S. soldiers that have to be doing the security, so that provided for by 49 nations. And I don't think anybody here recognizes that at its height, almost 50,000 of the 150,000 were Allied troops when there were 100,000 Americans. So I think recognizing the burden that is being shared, that those nations stepped up and continue to step up, even when the United States has lost interest in Afghanistan, those other nations continue to participate. I think the work that General Rapp and everybody is doing here with the international fellows, and that has been done with increasing international engagements, is a great way to work with the leaders of the future militaries in those nations to be able to facilitate that. So it's a combination of perhaps sending Dr. Collins there with his tough talk, but also having the effective engagement and appreciation for the contributions that allies do make in the niche capacity.
I agree completely with Mike, and I didn't want to seem all that negative because there has been a great contribution.
But you're better
and we're doing lessons learned of Iraq and Afghanistan study, and we tried to contrast the coalition in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the people who had spent most of their time in Iraq came back to us and beat us over the head and basically said, you know, you're wrong. You know, when the coalition got up and running in Iraq, there were tremendous contributions made by the allies in every dimension. And I don't want to make it seem as if I'm picking on the allies, because they actually have done a superb job in Afghanistan and also in Iraq.
Questions from the audience? Sir.
Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Schomburg. The start question is for Dr. Schake, but there's other panelists have commented on it as well. You talked about DoD submitting a budget in compliance with the law as a starting point. I guess I would counter or argue or ask the question, instead of using means as a starting point for strategy, I would offer that a whole or a potential area for discussion is the ends, which would be the starting point for strategy, and that if you could comment on your understanding of what the nation's grand strategy is, because the President's National Security Strategy in 2015, which you wrote on, Dr. Davidson, says, you know, two particular things. One, the U.S. is a global force for good, and that there is no global problem in the world that can be solved without the United States. And that points to a requirement for access to push global influence. Those are his words. So I would ask, you know, where then, if there is not a articulated end to which we can devise a strategy, how do we get to that? So understanding of what it is and then the reconciliation between the two. Thank you.
Yeah, so it would be a beautiful thing if these United States were able to articulate the three things we care about and are going to prioritize to. I don't think we live in that United States. And I think having a strategy that is fundamentally contradictory to who we are as a political culture means the strategy is never going to be a guidance to anything you're doing, right? We're a loud, messy, diverse, sloppy undertaking in these United States, and that's actually what's made us successful. And so I would just suggest to you that you're never going to get here's what we need to do in the world. What you're going to get is, with apologies, Janine, a big, sloppy national security strategy that says, well, we're a force for good and we need to do everything in the world because nothing is achievable without us. It's not true that nothing's achievable without us. Countries all over the world achieve all sorts of great things without us all the time. So we're not indispensable. We're just arrogant in suggesting that we're indispensable. But what we are really genuinely good at is, in the moment, figuring out what needs doing and how to do it. Because I don't think the American government is capable of identifying clearly what our priorities should be. I don't think we're capable of disciplined whole-of-government operations for the simple reason that we just keep not doing them, right? So I conclude from that that an elegant strategy that von Moltke would marvel at would be a great thing, but it wouldn't have any relevance to what the United States is doing in the world. My comfort in all of this is that we have the great good fortune to have a luxuriously wide margin of error, right? We're not, we as an army, we as a country, aren't good at having it right. We're good at getting it right. But that, of course, requires the time to adapt. And we indulge ourselves to believe that we're going to continue to have the time to adapt. We need to get a lot more paranoid about the nature of the threats and our ability to respond to them.
I would say on matching ends and means. I mean, I think Kori's right, but I think the method is iterative, right? I mean, you could start with your ends, what you want to accomplish with the defense strategy, and then take a look at your means and actually iterate back and decide, which is what they've been trying to do. Well, what parts of the strategy are we going to have to adjust? You know, and that's the only way you're going to do it. I just don't think that, I don't know what they're teaching you here, but I don't think that it's that linear. I don't think it's ever going to be that linear. Ends, ways, means. You're going to have to go back and forth. Now, on the grand strategy thing, I didn't write it, so I'm not going to totally defend it, Kori, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do think that this is, you know, go look at all, like what I do with my students, we look at all these national security strategies. They all have the same themes, you know. You're not going to get a grand strategy, not just because America's, you know, mushy and sloppy, which in many ways it is, but so is the world, right? So even if you did come out with a great grand strategy, it would be obsolete like on Tuesday, right? And so that's why if you're going to write one, and some of you in this room may end up being those hapless action officers serving in the White House having to write this sucker one day, about the best you're going to get is to articulate a philosophy for America's role in the world and how you're going to lead. And I actually don't think that this particular national security strategy says we're going to do everything all the time and nobody can do anything without us. I think what it says is that a lot of the big things that happen in the world really do need American leadership, and you've seen that over and over and over again. Just go to like the Munich Security Conference and watch everybody wring their hands and wait for America to say, well, let's do this or let's do that. Now, that said, so that's the sort of model for leadership is what you guys have just been talking about, which is America shows up, provides enabling things that help other people act. It's a catalyst for multilateral action, and I think that's a really good model for a lot of the messy, yucky problems that we have in the world. It may be about as good as you're going to get towards a grand strategy.
One quick final point. Sitting in the front here is Frank Hoffman, and if you haven't read his War on the Rocks post on how to be a strategist, it's the single best primer, and it clocks in at 800 words. You cannot improve upon this. I already have it printed out sitting on my desk.
Well done, Frank.
If I could put a chapeau on this conversation here, I think when we say strategy, we fixate on, okay, where's the document? Where can I read this? I think strategies are like planning. You know, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. I think strategies are nothing, but strategizing is really what needs to go on continuously. And in that continuous churn, you not only need to be looking at changes in the environment, but you also need to look at those things that are constant that you really want done. And if you had a third hand, on the third hand, what you would be doing is checking your assumptions every 5 minutes, because that's where we get in trouble all the time. You know, our assumption going into Iraq was that the war would be hard, the peace would be easy, and reconstruction would be paid for by the Iraqis. Yeah. We built an empire state building of military activity on those assumptions. And it took all of about a week and a half for them to crumble. And then we had nothing. Then we had nothing. Then we were, you know, we were in a pickup game of incredible complexity.
Sure. In between the seat there.
Okay, thank you. I'm a retired general from Bangladesh. I'm Inil Karim. I'm teaching in the University of Malaya. I'm coming from Kuala Lumpur. And I hear a lot on rebalancing strategy of the Americans. I'm a little confused because I've heard it so many times and from so many speakers. Is it really military sort of components you're talking mostly? Or it is, I read in some Chinese journal, they're saying America is trying to export values to the countries around China, like
Yes,
taking
of course we are.
democracy, human rights, rule of law. But when I talk to a military general or a military man, he says, no, we are going to have the 60% of our naval assets or military assets diverted to Pacific by 2020.
Okay, I can give you a quick and easy answer to
and
this.
I think that question, yeah, please respond to that. And sir, if you also.
I will too, sure. Go ahead,
Thank you.
Kori.
Okay, so the quick and easy answer is that the reason that the rebalancing looks solely military is that the Defense Department is the only agency of the American government that's any good at planning and resourcing. So what you see is the military piece of it because the Defense Department's the only part of the government that's able to do that. And yes, of course we're exporting our values. We hold these things to be self-evident. And if the Chinese feel threatened by that, then they ought to be worried about their own people who seem to share those values.
Well, look, I would also say that the reason you see everybody, the rebalance is like the elephant, in Blind Men and the Elephant. Everybody sees the part of it that they want to see. The military parts are the most obvious, not just because we can spend the most money and plan and get there, but because they're the biggest part. I mean, they're the most visible part. I mean, when you have an incredibly important TPP agreement that gets made, you don't see all these, people wearing suits sitting around the table on the news. I mean, that's just not sexy, right? But you're going to see an aircraft carrier, right? And so, but I think one of the great myths of the rebalance is that it's just military, and like I've written, neither the Hawks nor the Doves are happy about the rebalance because the Hawks think it's, not, unless we're setting the theater for some sort of war plan, they're not going to be happy. And the Doves, on the other hand, are like, oh my, we're moving an aircraft carrier. The 60% of a smaller force is still a smaller force.
Part of the problem is how we spend our money. In 1949, the budget for the State Department was half of the budget for the Defense Department. Today, it's about 10%. So, when programs get rolling and things get done, the visible aspects of the program are quite often military. At the same time that the rebalancing took place, the air-sea battle concept took off, and you had conferences where people, had these bizarre conversations out in the open about, whether or not how the Chinese would respond if we bombed their homeland. And it always seemed to me to be, it was like strategists on crack, They were having a conversation that if the Chinese had the same conversation about us out in the open, it would be considered to be very, very provocative. So I think the military end of it has been very much overdone, and not too much has really changed there in the short run, although there are longer-term things that are going on. The big things, I think, are economic and political. And, we'll see the evidence of that over time. It's a great idea. And for me, I used to be in the business of debating in the defense guidance the regional priorities. And it was incredible. We would have these great victories where, the great victory was changing the punctuation in a sentence. And the Army was always fighting for CENTCOM, and the Navy was always fighting for PACOM as to whether they were going to be second to NATO. And we always try to fudge that and change the language. It, in a way, was kind of ridiculous. It was really about wartime priorities in extremis. The truth of the matter is countries are all price takers, and they deal with what's put in front of them. And so if your principal preoccupation is in Asia Pacific, yet your forces are all in the Middle East, that's the world we live in.
Mike, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I'll conclude really where we began because it's a great question. much of the economic reorientation of the United States industry, the United States raw materials, the United States resources, and the United States trade already has shifted to Asia. The real question is, how can the military and national security policymakers leverage that, whether that's through trade agreements, whether that's through understanding the banking agreements, the monetary exchanges, and integrate that in as part of a coherent strategy so that we catch up with what the economy has already done.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel, and thank you also for your participation this morning in this endeavor. And thank you very much for your time.